We're going to have a movie today. We're going to have a quick introductory, a couple of slides, and we're going to talk about Genesis and the flood. And the reason we're going to talk about that is because that's where the attack on the church and the reality of Jesus' teaching in the New Testament began in the early 1800s. It was an attack on the age of the earth. Let's begin this with a prayer. Dear Lord, we gather together to look at your wonderful world and all the glorious creation that you gave to us and rewarded us with life and the possibility of life everlasting through Jesus Christ, your Son, our Lord. Amen. Amen. Welcome to our second session and Foundation of Faith, Jesus and Genesis. Remember, we went through the first session and it was all about looking at Genesis and all the doctrines in Genesis that point directly to the Lord and the sacrificial his sacrifice on the cross and how he died and rose again. In fact, Genesis 1 through 11 forms the foundation of all our doctrines. Now, I did make a mistake later. I taped it. Well, I recorded this and I made a couple of mistakes. And the problem I have is that I'm ADD and my mind is about 5 minutes ahead of my mouth. So let's talk about this. Remember in chapter 11 of Genesis, after Noah and his 3 sons and daughters-in-laws and wife exited the ark, they started to reestablish the human race. And God said, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Now, fill the earth means don't just stay where you are. It means go places. And they decided not to do that. And and his 3 sons, they were Ham, Japheth, and Shem. And Ham is the Egyptians and the Africans. Shem are pretty much the Middle East folks, and Japheth are the Indo-Europeans. What I said was, back it up. What I said, I put in there, instead of Shem, I put Seth, and that was my mistake. But I listened and I said the word Shem, but the word said Seth. So that was my fault. So I apologize for that. But remember, first 11 chapters of Genesis, really, if you take it as history, it is God's history of his relationship with the human race. And the real events in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, creation, the corruption, catastrophe, which is the flood, and the confusion at Babel, all lead up to Christ. And then we have the cross, and we have yet to go to the consummation, which would be, we would call that the second coming. And why does it matter what we believe? Well, a bunch of things. First of all, Jesus believes in, he's a new earth creationist. And if he's a creationist, and remember, he died and went to heaven, and we all say, well, when I die and I go to heaven, I'll know everything, right? Well, he did the trick of coming back. And he didn't say to his apostles, whoa, boys, I got those first chapters in Genesis all wrong. He never said that. And he did instruct the apostles after he came back. So, the first 11 chapters of Genesis talk about who was the last Adam, the reason for the gospel, the works of Jesus, marriage, God so loved the world. Where do we come up with sin and the horrible things in this world? And it also talks about God's law and God's love. And that is really based in the first 11 chapters. So our church, all our doctrines in the church and the life and death and the resurrection and the future coming of Jesus are all taught in the first 11 chapters if you look for it. Well, Jesus taught Genesis was real history. And he taught that there was a real Adam and Eve created at the beginning of time, that he affirmed that their son Abel was a prophet at the beginning of the world. He affirmed historicity of Noah and the global flood. and he affirmed the real history of Lot and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. He taught from those were parts of his teaching, and the way he described it, he believed it. So, who am I to say? Jesus worked, and the reason that we can say that he was not a deluded man of the first century, which is what, actually, if you take evolution and you mix it in with Genesis, what we're really saying is that the apostles and Jesus in the first century were just people that really didn't understand science. But remember, he was fully God and fully man, and so he would understand this. But when he worked his miracles, they were instant. They happened immediately, and they were completely. When we go and we have a horrible accident, we get put into the hospital, and they have to reconstruct some of our muscles and bones. What happens when we leave the hospital? We actually have to learn how to walk again, right? And when people get cochlear implants, they have to learn to listen again, right? But when Jesus did that, he instantly changed. When he cured people, he cured thousands, he cured hundreds and hundreds by instantaneously completing their body, including all the mental pathways and the learning and the balance. And when you give sight to the blind, how do they know what a color is? But they knew exactly, when those blind people opened their eyes, they knew exactly who they were talking to, because Jesus infused their mind with the complete regeneration. And the other thing was, for instance, 2 times he feeds thousands of people with a couple of fish and bread. And what happened was that if you read the Greek, it says he kept breaking apart. He kept breaking apart the pieces. And so every time he'd break it apart, a new one was formed. And that's what the Greek says. He kept breaking it apart. So he was instantly creating cooked food and of bread and fish. And you didn't have to catch the fish. Didn't have to wait for them to spawn. It didn't have to smoke them. It was instantly. And he also, the first miracle, he took wine. He made wine, aged wine, and fooled the steward. The steward said, "You got the best aged wine I ever saw." And he did it from water. So Jesus demonstrates he is the creator. So we can trust his words. And the other interesting thing is, no contemporary witness in the ancient world, and there were a lot of hostile witnesses, ever denied these acts. You can read what the Jewish leaders wrote. You can read what the Romans wrote, and the Greeks, which I have. None of them ever deny these. They sometimes say he was a sorcerer, but they do not say they never deny these acts. And remember, on the 6th day, the Word, the second person of the Trinity, created Adam in his image, and he gave dominion over all creation. So Adam is the first Lord of creation. And then magically and mysteriously, he took the side rib from Adam, and interesting thing, the rib is if you take your rib out, it's the only bone in the body that will regenerate itself. Interesting thing. He took a bone out, took a rib out, lovingly fashioned it into the most beautiful woman in the entire world. And they were created in a state of happiness and innocence, but they fell. They decided that they were going to believe Satan instead of God. And so that caused great catastrophe, which eventually resulted in the sacrifice of Jesus, which is really the remedy for Adam's fallen race. He rescued us from death and enmity with God, inherited from Adam. And so he's our kinsman redeemer. He is one of us. He had to be a direct descendant of Adam in order to rightfully repay for Adam's offense against God. And we're in a war of worldviews. Remember, we talked about that all we have is the observable data in the present world. And depending on how we think about things, what's our framework for reference, that's how that information fits into our mind. And there are 2 basic philosophical standpoints, and one is a creationist standpoint, which is God created, and the other one is there's a materialist, which is really an atheist position, which is all of this happened by itself, just leave things alone, and hydrogen molecules over eons will turn into Harvard professors. That's the story. Okay? Hydrogen molecules turn into Harvard professors. So it's how we'd interpret everything, and you look at the same thing. You see the bone in the sediment, and somebody sees it barcoded with 350 million years on it, and I look at it and I say 4,500 years. That's the difference. So what is this evolution we keep talking about? There are really all different kinds of evolution. And let's talk about cosmic evolution. Is the Big Bang. What happened was nothing exploded and turned into hydrogen gas, and that was the beginning of the universe. And that happened 12.5 billion years ago, 13.5, whatever the number is they have today. And it was nothing exploded into everything. And then over millions and millions of years, stars formed, galaxies coagulated, and planets formed. And then, on this planet, the Earth's feature started out as a molten ball of rock, and it cooled and rained, and you've heard the story. And over years, Earth's features formed all by themselves. And then the next one is this is the one that's the big hook. It's called common descent, or common ancestry. And what that says is that sometime on this lifeless planet, dead chemicals got together and somehow formed the first living thing, whatever that was, some cell. And that cell changed and mutated over eons of time and turned into you. Okay? Going through all these variations of all these different transformations. And that's called I call it goo to you evolution. Okay? And then there is variation or adaptation. Variation and adaptation is, you got 17 different kinds of chickens, and everybody in this room looks different. And we have different dogs, we have different fruit trees. These are all we observe change over time within the genetic limit of a life form. And then there's chemical evolution, which we talked about, which was life formed from dead chemicals over eons of time. But you know, we've heard about the law of biogenesis, life comes only from life. But somewhere that was suspended according to them. Now here's the trick. This is called the bait and switch. You know what a bait and switch is, right? Every time, oh by the way, geologic evolution was the core for Darwin's theory, because it said the Earth was very old. Variation is the only, this one, adaptation or variation, is the only evolution we ever observe. Only. We don't observe any other evolution. We talk about it, we write scientific treatises about it, we build natural history museums and line up skeletons and talk about it, but it's the only one that we ever see. And we say, well, since dogs change, a bear, and this is from Darwin, a bear must have changed into a whale. And then we build up a fanciful story about it. Now, it's not fancy if you're a scientist and this is your job, and you've been trained to do this. So you try to think, well, how could all this DNA and genetics change a bear swimming in the ocean with its mouth open? Over long periods of time, it turned into a whale. And that's the story. That's the scientific story. Except today they say it's a hippopotamus. But this is the only thing that's ever seen. Variation. And the bait and switch is, if you look at a textbook, it says, here's all the different kinds of dogs. Here's all the different kinds of peach trees. That, you know, you have peach and you have nectarines and you have plums. They're all interfertile. And because we know those things change, and we know that things can change from one thing into another. So there's this bait and switch. We go from here, we teach this with facts, and we infer this. Bait and switch. Okay, evolution is the only scientific theory that requires legislation and court orders to be taught in schools without controversy. You don't need to have legislation to teach the law of gravity. You don't have legislation to teach the law of thermodynamics. I'm sorry. There goes mine. You don't need any of those laws, but you do actually need legislation, because otherwise it would never get taught. And so the question is evolution really science, or is it faith? Because remember, what did I say last week? Without any evidence, without any real hard evidence, evolution is just a faith position. Because the faith position starts out that there is no God. That's a theological position, right? That's a theological decision. There is no God, therefore all this stuff happened by itself. Very famous person, William Provine, who's head of the biology program at Cornell University, says modern evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear there's no gods, no purpose, no goal-directed forces of any kind, no life after death. There's no ultimate foundation for ethics, do what feels good, no ultimate meaning of life. When you die, you just turn into worms. And there's no free will, because it's really all about chemicals. Remember, it's these chemicals that are smashing into each other. It's all this dynamism there. That's really what's causing you to think the way you think. So therefore, I kind of wonder, can I believe what he says if he thinks that there's no free will? That maybe he was forced by his DNA to say that. Okay, you seem a bit, here are the three kids, you seem a bit down after that science class. What happened? Well, gee whiz, our teacher said we're nothing special. We all came from some kind of giant soup, and we're just evolved monkeys. Oh, I feel bad about that. So one other kid says, well, what class do you have next? Self-esteem. I think this is high school. The Bible teaches this, which is to say that there was a creation in there, and that Jesus had to have real human ancestors going all the way back to Adam, because he is the one that resolved Adam's problems for us. And here are the various places, and so we have Adam, and here's Noah, and here's Shem. Remember, that's the godly line. And then we had the dispersion at Babel, and Peleg was a descendant, and Peleg's line led to Abraham. Now, everybody believes that Abraham lived. But the question is, what about all these? And then from Abraham down to, now that's, this is Genesis, and here's King David. That would be 2 Samuel. And this is the line going through David's son Solomon, which is Joseph's line, and here's the line in Luke that goes through Nathan, the son of the brother of the other son of David. And so what we're being told in school is that this actually is the story, and that is apes led to Abraham and not Adam. And all this stuff is just, all the things I crossed out is just legend. So the goal with evolutionists is to destroy the belief in the historical Adam. Okay, if you can destroy the belief in Adam, then Christ doesn't really have a mission. Because there's no original sin, so why did he even come and die? It makes no sense. Belief in modern evolution makes atheists of people. They know it, and we don't. But Jesus said, for if you believed in Moses, that is the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, you would believe in me, for he wrote about me. And if you don't believe his writings, how will you believe my words? And Jesus said Moses composed Genesis. Now, let's talk about Genesis. Back in the old days, people wrote on clay tablets like that. It was a palm size or slightly bigger, and they had a stylus, and they put marks in here, and that was their writing system for many, many thousands of years. And most likely Genesis was compiled by Moses from tablets that were given to him by his ancestors, from Adam to Joseph. And we found tens of thousands of these tablets all over the place, and they all have the same structure, which is interesting. It starts out with the subject, and it ends with a colophon. We have a colophon. Here's a colophon right here. It says, Censored Science by Bruce Malone. That's, in literary term, that's called a colophone. Okay? Now, the difference is that in the Western world, the colophone is here. In the Mid-East, the colophone is here on the back. So when you get to the last page, it says, oh, this was the story of Censored Science by Bruce. That's the difference. And so Genesis, if you look at Genesis, it reveals that there were 11 places where this word toledoth, which means the account of, are in Genesis. And those are the colophons in Genesis that show a tablet structure. And here's the tablet structures. And these are, the author is probably, the first one was God and Adam. Remember, God talked to Adam in the garden. So Adam is Genesis 1 to, and the heavens and earth, that's the subject. And so you can actually find these colophons in the Bible. So if you look, you'll see, and these are the generations of. That's one way of translating it, and the other way is, this is the account of. So remember, that's the end mark. So everything above that, from the last colophon, is the story that was on that tablet that Moses had. And tablets were fired for, in a kiln. And any questions about that? Yeah.
Can you go back to it just for a second, or is it too? Oh, okay. Can you give us years? Can you give us years, chronological? Like, number one, yes. What would we say? You're saying 4,500 BC? No.
No, that's for the flood, 6,000 years ago.
Okay.
Or year zero.
Okay.
Year zero, years 1656.
Okay.
Okay, or 4,500 years ago.
Got it. Thank you.
And Terah, and who was Terah? Anybody remember? That was Abraham's father, right?
Oh.
Right. That was 1500 BC. Jesus taught the flood. Remember, Jesus says the flood was real. For as in the days of Noah, he talks now for his teaching on the second coming. He says it's going to be just like the flood that happened to Noah. And all those people back there believed that, and we believed it until about 1850. And that until the day that Noah entered the ark, nobody really realized that there was going to be a flood, even though God gave 120 years for Noah to build the ark and to preach salvation. It was a huge ark, and there was room for a lot of people, but only his family came. His brothers, his sisters, his mom, his dad, his aunts and uncles, and his cousins. None of them came. So there was a global flood. It was about 4,500 years ago. God destroyed the world that was. And if you look at, there's been surveys of the peoples all over the world. They all have a flood story. How can this be? And these are, just as an example, here are the basics of the flood story. And these are all the nations, and they all have flood stories. So the question is, if worldwide there are at least 300 different flood stories, why is that true? But people haven't communicated with each other in thousands of years. Because there's a memory of a real event called the flood. Now, it started back in 1671, Nicholas Steno was observing how sediment formed in harbors in Italy, okay? And what he said was, gee whiz, waterborne sediment forms, and then hardens, and then another layer forms and hardens, and then another layer forms and hardens, and another layer forms and hardens. And so there's this gradual process where there are these layers that are formed in the bottom of a harbor. Now what you know about a harbor is there usually aren't any water currents in harbors, right? So he noted how silt forms. And that's true. It actually does work this way. But where the silt on the bottom is a little bit younger, a little bit older than the silt on the top in still water. However, our friend Charles Lyell, remember Charles Lyell? He wrote the Principles of Geology in 1830. He was a God hater. Okay, he hated Christianity. He wanted to destroy the story of Genesis. And he said, take Moses out of science. And so he observed that there were lots of layers. So he doesn't believe in creation. So he's going to come up with an alternate story. And he noted, and he said, well, based on Steno, all these rock layers that we see were formed from the bottom to the top, new on old. And they're deposited worldwide, so it must be logically that if I find a critter in one layer here, and I go over there and I find the same critter in that layer, it must have been laid down at the same time, so it was the same age. And the age is based on the sediment rates in calm water. It takes a long time for stuff to settle into calm water. You know, like every 50 years they dredge a harbor. They don't dredge it not usually every day. We're talking about many, many, many years. And the sedimentary layers are 10,000 feet tall, 10,000 feet high. So that would have had to been a lot of sedimentation. So the strata with the same fossils must be the same age. And that he, in 1830, with no clue about how old any of this stuff was, he said one of these major layers, like the Cretaceous, the Jurassic, the Triassic, the Permian, the Cambrian, they all took about 20 million years. How did he get that number? There it is, right out of the air. 20 million years. So if I find a trilobite or a horseshoe crab in a Cambrian rock, that's going to tell me that how old that layer is. The fossil's age is going to be based on how old that is, and Cambrian is 240 million years old in his estimation. And the other thing is that the strata's age is based on the index fossils. So it's just a vicious circle. It makes no sense. Okay, which is to say, there's no clock there. It's just that this position is the age, and the age is what he decided it was. So the column, and the other interesting thing about the geologic column, this is the Bible of evolution. This is the equivalent of the Bible of evolution. And the geologic column is a hypothetical construct. Now, all of you who took geology in college, you're going to throw tomatoes at me. But actually, there is no full column found anywhere in the world except in textbooks and natural history museums. If you go to Grand Canyon, and that's the best example of the geologic column. There are huge portions of that column, huge portions just gone. And it's this with this, okay? And this whole 150 million years is missing, as an example. So how did that happen? We're taught that this is a column, represents age and history, but it's only found in textbooks. It's a hypothetical construct. And let's talk about the standard fossil explanation. And as fish dies, falls to the ground, after several weeks, the soft body tissues have mostly been decayed, and tectonic earthquake activity induces nearby sediment to bury it, and then eventually sediment forms into rock, and that's how we get it. The only problem is that's not how things work. And this is, if you go to the Texas textbook, you'll see this, Texas biology textbook, they have this explanation. First of all, dead fish float, okay, and they're scavenged. I don't know if you're a fisherman, that's what happens. You throw dynamite into a pond of water, they all come up to the top. Fish decomposes quickly into bits, they filter down if they haven't been eaten, and there's nothing left of the fish for the earthquake to cover with sediment. That's how it works. It's exceedingly rare, and the seabeds aren't covered by organisms being fossilized. There's nothing there. Plains aren't covered by herds of bison fossils, and they're not the results of a gradual process, and they only occur in waterborne sediment. And so the question is, how are all the land-dwelling vertebrates fossilized? They must have been underwater. Since 1651, no one has ever tested how sediments form. But Guy Berthaud tested it about 15 years ago in the University of Colorado School of Engineering, and he ran sediment down with water and watched the layering. What you see is the water, if there are variations in the water velocity, the layers form parallel. They do not form one on top of the other. They form in this direction. And the age is this way, not this way. It's horizontal. So this is the newest amount of sedimentation. So this layer right here, okay, is newer than that layer. Bet you didn't think about that, did you? There's no clock that you can assign to sedimentation in moving water. And think about a flood with all this billions and billions of gallons of water just sloshing around, and the sediment there, whatever was buried all at once within a short period of time, weeks. And when you find fossils, here's something interesting. Here's a predatory fish. There's a Rhamphorhynchus, that's a flying lizard, like a pterodon, and pterodactyl, and it's caught. See, the fish has caught it by its wing, and if you look inside the fish, you look inside the pterodactyl, you'll actually see an undigested fish in there. And this all happened instantaneously. How fast was that fossil formed? Amazingly fast. So actually, what it looks like is just cement dumped on all these organisms. Okay, here's a fish eating a fish. Here's a ichthyosaur giving birth. This is a jellyfish. Ever see a jellyfish form a fossil? How would that happen? You had to have cement dump on it. Okay. And then one last other thing that you may find is interesting is that they're all over the world. There are these trees. See, if you didn't see these tree trunks going through those layers, they'd say, oh, 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, 4 million, 5 million years old. But here's the tree trunk growing right up, and this is in Arkansas. You can go look at it.
Where?
I'll give you the reference. And these are tree trunks, and these tree trunks are this big. Okay, so this is like a meter across. They're growing up through, they're not growing up, they're surrounded by what once was soft sediment. You can see the flow lines in here. They were buried all at once. It's best explained by burial. The ark was huge. It could hold 522 railway cars. Not bad. And they'd done tests, and it was stable for up to withstand waves of 230 feet high. Big wave. Okay. And you also hear that, was there a local flood? Well, that's kind of a silly explanation, because if it was local, why bother even to build an ark? Just go over the mountain. Okay. Doesn't make any sense. Now we're going to have a movie. And this is from the Answers in Genesis. I think you'll enjoy it. I needed it. All the animals on the ark. And God said, come on to the ark. So he was already in there. Fountains of the great deep burst forth. Here's the Mid-Atlantic and Mid-Pacific trenches.
mud layers over continents, or coal seams covering entire states, or fossil graveyards, or frozen mammoths, or miles of underground cave passages, or thick ice sheets moving over continents, or craters of supervolcanoes, or canyons cut thousands of feet deep. It looks like the present is not the best way to explain the geological features of the past. The Bible, however, offers another way to explain features from the past. Noah's flood was a global judgment, a violent catastrophe upon the earth. Based on this truth revealed in God's Word, scientists are developing a series of models to explain how the flood and its aftermath could have shaped the world today. In the course of the flood, erosion washed away mountains of rock in some places, while miles of mud and sand were piled up in others. The earth's crust was thickened in some places and thinned in others. Like jostled ice cubes sink and bob up to their proper level in the water, some sections of land sank after the flood, while other sections rose. Supervolcanoes and superquakes rocked the world after the flood. As the centuries passed, the catastrophes became rarer and smaller. Modern earthquakes and volcanoes are dim leftovers from this violent period of Earth history. Warm oceans after the flood produced violent weather, possibly even hypercanes, huge hurricanes like the Great Red Spot on Jupiter, which may have persisted for centuries. High rainfall after the flood filled enormous lakes, eroded large canyons, and carved cave systems. As animals left the ark, multiplied and spread over the earth, many of them were preserved as fossils. Some were buried in ash and mud. Some were preserved by unique chemical conditions, and others were frozen. Surely the present is not the way things were in the past. Instead, the Bible is the key to help us understand geological features around the world. On May 18, 1980, Mount St. Helens, located 95 miles south of Seattle, Washington, erupted. The eruption was triggered by an earthquake centered beneath the mountain that measured 5.1 on the Richter scale. The lateral blast swept out the north side of Mount St. Helens at 300 miles per hour. With temperatures as high as 660 degrees Fahrenheit and the power of 24 megatons of thermal energy, it snapped 100-year-old trees like toothpicks and stripped them of their bark. Before the famous eruption at Mount St. Helens, scientists were mostly familiar with slow-acting examples of geologic change. But at Mount St. Helens, geologists watched the Earth's surface change quite rapidly. Icebergs were buried in hot avalanche material. They melted and formed badlands in days. Eruptions on May 18 and June 10 produced fine layers in hours. On June 10, mud flows cut zigzag canyons 100 feet deep in soft sand and mud, complete with perpendicular side canyons. Canyons that are reminiscent of the geography of Grand Canyon, only 40 times smaller and clearly produced within hours. Mud flows over the following decade cut hundreds of feet into solid rock in just days of cutting time. Fallen trees formed a log mat on the surface of Spirit Lake and dropped bark to the bottom of the lake, accumulating up to 3 feet of bark peat in just a couple years. And vertically floating logs sinking to the bottom of the lake resulted in buried trees in only a decade, similar to the trees of Yellowstone's fossil forest, which are also buried in volcanic layers. Even though Mount St. Helens is a very small catastrophe compared to the flood or the major catastrophes immediately Rock layers are visible in mountains, plateaus, and canyons all over the world. Where did these rock layers come from? Present processes aren't the answer. Today, sand and mud are usually deposited in thin layers along the outer edge of continents. And the formation of fossils today is rare. But somehow in the past, thick layers of sand and mud were spread across entire continents and filled with well-preserved fossils. Noah's flood suggests a way to explain these puzzling features. Flooding the continents, for example, could carry sea creatures many hundreds of feet above present sea level. Andrew Snow is a PhD geologist from Australia who has spent over 30 years studying rocks, working in the field and in the lab.
We find marine creatures buried at the top of the Grand Canyon, which is over a mile above sea level.
A global flood could carry sand and mud enormous distances.
Some of the sand grains that in the Navajo sandstone had to have come from the Appalachians. But what river or what process today is carrying material from the Appalachians to the southwest?
A global flood could quickly lay down thick layers of mud and sand, burying even giant animals and tall trees.
We've got coal beds with trees sitting on them, and these trees, tree stumps, go through many strata, which means that before they could rot, you have to have lots of sand and mud coming in quickly. Several places in the Grand Canyon, 4,000 feet of different types of sand and mud and lime have been bent, and they've been bent while they're still soft. Both the bottom layer and the top layer are all bent the same way, which means that a whole sequence of 4,000 feet of sand and mud and lime had to have been laid down very quickly by the waters and then bent very soon afterwards.
A global flood could form thick layers across entire continents.
In the Grand Canyon area, we've got limestone beds, the red wall limestone. The same limestone can be found over here in the eastern United States.
A global flood could cut deeply and widely.
We've got this huge flat surface at the rim of the Grand Canyon, which goes for thousands of square miles, where rivers on a great scale of a vast area just swept over it and swept everything clean.
None of these processes, deep, wide erosion, or thick, rapid layering, or continent-wide distribution, or lifting of marine organisms above sea level, or sand carried across continents, occur in the present. Radically different processes are required, such as occurred during Noah's flood. Dead organisms usually don't last long. Scavengers and bacteria consume them quickly. Soft tissues rarely last more than days or weeks, and hard parts like bones or shells only a month or two. But the rocks of Earth contain billions and billions of fossils, and in many places, millions of fossils are exquisitely preserved, even soft parts. How can this be? To preserve a body, it needs to be put in a safe place. Extremely cold or dry places would protect them, but most organisms don't live in those conditions. There is another solution: rapid burial. If a body is sealed from oxygen out of reach of burrowing animals, then it has a good chance of fossilizing intact. Rapid burial is uncommon today, but there's much evidence of massive burials in the past. Not only are many fossils well preserved, they're found amidst very fine sediment layers. Fine layers rarely last in the present because all sorts of animals are digging around in the mud and soil, searching for food. In just a few weeks or months, the original layers are destroyed. But in the fossil record, churned up sediments are rare. If these sediments were laid down rapidly, however, they'd prevent burrowers from doing their job. And there are thousands of feet of such layers in the fossil record all over the world. This suggests that moving water lifted up mud and sand rapidly over a wide area. And the process lasted several months. A year-long global flood, as described in the Bible, is the best explanation we know for the well-preserved fossils and fine layering throughout the rocks of the earth. Appears in vast deposits scattered over the continents. It is typically thought that such deposits require many thousands to millions of years to form. 10 feet of plant material is needed to make 1 foot of coal. Evolutionary geologists teach that most coal deposits are basically a result of peat building up in swamps over millions of years. And since peat accumulates very slowly in modern swamps, long periods of accumulation would be required at modern rates. But forming coal this way has problems. For example, the top and bottom of coal seams are usually flat, and thin layers of mud are often found within coal seams. In the present world, however, roots of plants in the swamp break up the peat layers and mess up any mud layers which might form. Tree trunks especially penetrate the swamp peat, making it very uneven. Apparently, no modern process can explain how coal originated. The flood of the Bible, however, may provide an explanation. In the course of the flood, weeks of unceasing rains eroded away soil and plants, and rising seas and tidal waves destroyed the forests of the world. Some plants would be buried in place, some would be ground up and destroyed. Most, however, probably floated atop the floodwaters until they became waterlogged and sank to the bottom. A continuous rain of sinking plants could produce the thick layers of plant material needed to form coal beds. Undisturbed by growing plants, such layers would have flat lower and upper surfaces, and in between could be undisturbed layers of mud. Bark rubbing off logs would explain coals made of bark. And vertical trees sinking would explain stumps sitting atop coal layers without penetrating them. Both have been observed at Mount St. Helens. The flood provides an explanation for the origin of coal, consistent with an Earth only thousands of years old. The enormous coal reserves on our planet are a reminder and
How long does it take to form
to a
coal?
beautiful and bountiful world now lost.
Well, there are plants in the world. I mean, there are factories in the world that produce oil in a week, okay, and coal in 2 days.
The Earth's surface is scarred
I
by
think there's
deep
more
canyons
to this.
cut into solid rock. But how did they form? A little bit of water over a long time, or a little bit of time with a lot of water? Modern rivers don't generally cut downward into the solid rock, so today's river erosion seems incapable of explaining rock canyons. The Great Flood of the Bible, however, provides a possible explanation for such canyons. In soft mud or sand in your own backyard, you can see the power of heavy rains on a small scale. A rainstorm can create miniature canyons in only minutes. Though these canyons are very small, cut into mud, they share many of the same characteristics as the world's Great Canyons. On a larger scale, mud flows have also been observed to form these features quickly. At Mount St. Helens, a single mud flow off the mountain carved Engineer's Canyon out of soft sediment in a single day, 100 feet deep. And the same thing even happened in solid rock. A series of mud flows created lip and step canyons face of Mount St. Helens, cutting hundreds of feet into solid rock over just a few years. We observe canyons being cut into rock today, but only by catastrophic processes. Just imagine how easy it would be to cut massive canyons during and after Noah's flood. Torrential water and mud flows, followed by uplift and heavy rains, created the right conditions to produce the world's canyons. Furthermore, it may have been easier when flood sediments had not fully hardened. Grand Canyon is a good example where we find evidence of catastrophic forces at work. Upstream is evidence of huge lakes. These lakes would never have formed if the canyon were already open below them. However, if these lakes had formed from rains after Noah's flood, and if the pressure of these waters broke through and carved through the recently deposited sediments, then we would expect to find surge deposits downstream. Below Grand Canyon, this is precisely what we find. Evidence of a lot of water cutting over a little bit of time. miles away in the Indian Ocean, but nowhere in between? Why do we find identical plants on either side of the Atlantic Ocean? These kinds of disjunct or split ranges can't be explained by the way organisms travel and live in the present. The worldwide flood described in the Bible and its effects on the earth may offer essential clues to explain these split ranges. Of course, many fish were able to survive outside the ark. Even freshwater animals could survive. Many people don't realize that fresh water from rivers like the Amazon can float for years above the ocean without mixing. So freshwater animals could survive the flood in fresh water, floating above the salty ocean water. Many plants that weren't on the ark could have floated during the flood, some even in the floating freshwater. As the floodwaters receded, plants and fish would have been left behind at lakes and other places around the world. Many plants would have continued to float, providing a way to distribute animals after the flood. After Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, hundreds of thousands of Douglas fir trees were ripped up and remained floating on the lake 25 years later. If Noah's flood ripped up every forest in the world, mats of trees probably stayed afloat for centuries. As winds blew these enormous log mats in circular paths in the oceans, they would have served as rafts for animals to cross oceans. Rafts may also explain how tortoises got to remote islands. Interestingly, most modern animals and plants with ranges split across oceans follow the pattern of modern currents. Their distribution can be explained by rafting. In this way, the flood and its aftermath provide a solution for one of the many mysteries of biology: split ranges.
Well, if you'd like to go on. It can't be much longer because it's... Oh, this is the last one, Ice Age. We'll get out in time for the sermon.
The ice on Greenland and Antarctica is in places miles deep and hundreds of miles wide. In the present, however, all but the edges of these ice sheets are cold deserts. Not enough snow and ice falls there to build up the depth of ice that we find today, even if long periods of time were available. The flood of the Bible may provide an answer. First of all, flood rocks contain thick piles of lava and huge volumes of volcanic ash. Meteorologist Mike Ward has suggested that this might have led to the Ice Age.
There was a lot of warm water added to the pre-flood oceans from the crust, and also a lot of lava flows and volcanism that heat the waters.
Evidence in fossils suggests that the oceans were warmed up in the course of the flood.
The average temperature of the ocean is 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, after the flood, it could have been an average of about 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and you could have taken a swim in the Arctic Ocean right after the flood. It was so warm. But then it's going to start cooling down, and that cooling is mainly by evaporation. So the key here is that for that warm water, you evaporate so much more water vapor from the air.
As the oceans cooled after the flood, heavy snow began to fall. Computer simulations that begin with the warm oceans show snow falling far inland over cool continents. Ice sheets build up thousands of feet thick, where we see evidence for such ice today. This ice built up in only a few centuries of time. The whole process was sped up by volcanic ash cooling the earth after the flood.
And because of the instability of the earth after the flood, there'd be a lot of volcanism. Aerosols are tiny particles about a micron in diameter, and they'll float up there in the stratosphere for several years, and they reflect sunlight back to space. So you have a cooling mechanism. The ice is going to build up, and then finally it's going to come to a point where it's going to peak. That's glacial maximum.
Once the oceans cooled enough and the evaporation slowed, the snows stopped, and the ice began to melt. Calculations suggest that the buildup, movement, and melting of ice did not require many thousands of years as is traditionally taught. From a warm world at the end of the flood to the melting of the ice took only centuries of time.
And then I see evidence of the one ice age, a short, rapid ice age that melts catastrophically. This is what I see based on science.
Present climate is not the key to understanding what produced thick piles of ice in Greenland and Antarctica. It looks like the Bible had the key all along. The great flood in the days of Noah.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that.